IVM.
This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world.
कुमार गंधर्व once said, कलासारखी बदलत असणार, जी जन्माला आली की मृत्यू आहे त्याला. अशाला तुम्ही सारखं बांधून ठेवतात, म्हैस बांधल्यासारखे. संगीतासारखी कलासारखी बदलत असते. म्हणजे त्याचं शास्त्र बदलत नाही, त्याचं सौंदर्य बदलतं. Today we have Srijan Deshpande with us on Audiogyan. He's a dedicated student, performer, researcher, teacher, and archivist of Hindustani Raga Sangeet. Srijan is currently pursuing a doctoral research project at Manipal Centre of Humanities, in which he is attempting to construct a rigorous account of Pandit Kumar Gandharva's musical alterity in the context of 20th century tradition of khayal. We'll be talking about wide-ranging topics from manyata in the context of tradition to music research. Of course, keeping the legendary Kumar Gandharva in the backdrop, who's probably apparently considered as a rebel in Hindustani classical music. We'll see what happens there. A quick shout out to Baitak Foundation and Dakshina Dwarka Foundation for introducing me to Srijan at a wonderful workshop called Talking with Tradition, which happened in June 2022 at Pune. More details in the show notes. So yeah, welcome Srijan to Audiogyan, and it's a real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. The honor and the pleasure is entirely mine. I have been a fan of Audiogyan for a while, and you guys are doing tremendous work. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm honored that you're liking Audiogyan. Like I started off with Kumar Gandharva, but we'll be sort of diving deep into a very subjective exploration kind of a subject called music, and how one could go about research, or how do you where do you start, and those kind of questions. But before just getting into that zone, I wanted to ask you, in sort of most Indian classical art forms, be it sort of painting or dance or music, even in spirituality, things are sort of communicated in metaphors, and one has to decode them based on context. Lot of people give commentaries on it. So do you see that happening in music? And if yes, then if you can give some examples, or maybe you can start off with why do you have these metaphors? Because when I was attending Talking with Tradition, one of the person told me there that the metaphors are sort of to make it timeless, so that it's not confined in a box. म्हणजे आपण जेव्हा वीणा instrument बद्दल बोलत होता, कुणाल जोशी, so maybe you can give some context and explain.
Sure. Yeah. No, the idea of metaphor is certainly important to Hindustani music, but I'd like to sort of step back a little bit and say that the idea of metaphor is important. Where is it not important, right? To which form of art is it not important? A metaphor is a very potent tool of articulation. If you want to say something that is difficult to say, one easy way to do it is to use a metaphor, right? So, I mean, for example, now you quoted Kumarji a while ago, and like we spoke about a little earlier when I was talking to you about this show, we said that Kumar Gandharva was sort of going to be at the background of what we're talking about, although we're going to bring the conversation a little more to research. But the reason why Kumarji is sort of at the backdrop of this is because that is where I come from. He sort of overshadows and is very much a part of the fabric of what I do, and where my thinking about music and my tutelage also comes from. So let's start with a quote from him that you read out in the beginning, and a part of that quote I believe was Shastra badlat nahi, saundarya badalta. Shastra does not change, beauty changes, right? What does this mean? So because you were talking about metaphor and articulation, I'd like to talk for a minute about the term Shastra. We call Hindustani music Shastriya Sangeet. What is Shastra? Who writes this Shastra? Who reads this Shastra? Where does it come from? Right?
And can we loosely translate Shastra to be science?
Yes, so that is an interesting question in itself. But for now, let's say theory. We'll get into that a little bit because it's a very interesting problem. Yeah. Do remind me if I forget to come back to this.
Sure.
How do you translate this term? But what is Shastra? So how do you, I mean, a very fundamental question like that, how do you start to answer it? Okay, so there are very rigorous ways in which you can address this problem, but let's keep it simple for now. Let's say, how is Shastra dealt with in the community of Shastriya Sangeet? Okay, so you have performers, you have audiences, you have scholars, you have critics, you have lay listeners, informed listeners, and all of them are sort of intrigued, perhaps mystified, challenged by this idea of Shastra. Okay, broadly, I think you can say that there are two ways in which you can deal with Shastra. One is faith, and one is skepticism. Now, if you're someone who just wants to sing, you know, ki mala konitari, I hope it's all right if I slip into Marathi every now and
Absolutely.
then. Yeah, all right, okay. Because that happens. You're talking about Hindustani music, so it's difficult to stick to English. So if you're talking about someone who's a performer and who just wants to sing, you know, कुणाकडनं तरी मी गाणं शिकलोय आणि कोणाचं तरी गाणं मला फार प्रभावित करतं. I've been inspired and I want to make music like this, or I've learned music, I have a certain affinity for it and I want to sing. Okay, and I go to a guru, I learn from that person, I am taught a certain grammar, a certain set of rules, and I trust in that person. It might be a single person, it might be a gharana, it might be I don't know what, but there is faith. And your whole approach to it is ki, okay, I have received this information, I'm going to implement it in my singing, and I sing. Okay, questioning what is being taught to you takes a bit of a backseat. The other approach is skepticism. Okay, now what I find very interesting is that if you have faith, if you approach music as a performer with only faith, okay, obviously in order to become a competent performer, and there are lots of great performers who are not necessarily great thinkers in a linguistic sense. Okay, in the sense, this is again something that Kumarji used to often say, ki kale madhe vichar karna, thinking in the arts is something, being analytical is something that wasn't there very much in this music, in the not too distant past. Okay.
Yeah.
So what were these? And they were great musicians. They were brilliant people, obviously, but they weren't analytical in the way we think of analysis today. Okay. But the fact that they were able to create great music, they were able to assimilate the movements of a rag and weave something out of it, means that they were thinkers. Okay. So then what was it that they did not have? They did not have a particular facility of articulation. Language. Being able to articulate what you're doing in your music, what you're thinking about through language. So there was obviously a Shastra that they built up for themselves, in their minds, in their throats, in their bodies. Okay. By means of which they were able to sing. But it was an unarticulated Shastra.
Can you give an example? Because is
Sure.
it sort of communicating just by the expression through words, or is it?
So by articulation, I mean language. Okay. आता
म्हणजे बंदिशवर स्ट्रेस दिला rather than
नाही मी असं म्हणतोय की शास्त्र म्हणजे काय, व्हॉट यू मीन बाय शास्त्र? सो यू मीन वन एक्झाम्पल ऑफ शास्त्र कुड बी दॅट यू आर अलाउड टू डू सो सा नी रे. This is a typical phrase in Kalyan, in the Rag Kalyan, but you cannot go in the conventional sense of Kalyan, you can't do sa ni sa re. हे नाही करू शकत. सा नी रे. सो नी रे करू शकता, सा स्किप करून नी सा रे करू शकत नाही. दिस इज, आय एम गिव्हिंग यू अ क्रूड सिम्प्लिस्टिक एक्झाम्पल. ओके, बट दिस इज वन एक्झाम्पल ऑफ वॉट शास्त्र टेल्स यू की नी रे मेक्स कल्याण, नी सा रे डज नॉट मेक कल्याण. Okay, it can get much more complicated than that, but let's not get into technicalities right now. This is an example of Shastra, and there can be Shastra of Rag, of Tal, of Shruti, of this and that, of various things. Okay, now notation. Now in order to articulate this, in order to give you an example of Shastra, I was able to employ language. Right? I was able to use musical notation. But many of the greatest musicians of the past were not necessarily great with notation. Very often notation wasn't even taught. You know, Guruji सांगायचे की मी जे गातो ते गा. Don't ask me questions. Just do what I'm telling you to do. And that was an accepted mode of teaching music. And there are scholars today who will argue that that is the right way to teach Hindustani music. Right? And there are scholars who will argue that no, this is not necessarily the best way. There are other ways. But there's a whole debate there, which we'll address at some point. But, so musical notation written, so what is notation? Notation is sound represented visually. Right? So it is language. It is a form of articulation. That's exactly what the written word is. If I read a book, what I'm doing in my mind is I'm turning that text back into sound. That text in the first place is sound turned into a visual.
Beautiful.
Isn't it? And in fact, I mean, this is digressing a little bit, but I was reading an article just yesterday about these researchers on voice who are now saying that, I mean, it's a known fact now that while reading, we are actually making sound. Even if we read silently, our vocal cords are functioning at the time, and we're making very, very, very soft articulations. Okay, so it is not possible to read absolutely silently. Human beings don't work like that. So text is a representation of sound, just like notation is. So my point is, coming back, that notation is language. It's expressing one medium through another. And that is something that great musicians don't necessarily have facility in. They're not necessarily experts at that. Leave alone the kind of language I'm using now, that musicologists and scholars use. Talking about the process and the culture and the experience of music making in language. Using words, describing it. Ki I sing a rag beautifully. I compose a beautiful bandish. Manje kai, what is it that I do? Expressing this in language is a whole other kind of challenge. That's what I mean when I say articulation. Okay? Because if my Guruji tells me ki you are supposed to do this and you're not supposed to do that, then if I am a Shraddhalu, a faithful student, I'll say, Haji Guruji, Namaskar, and I'll sing it. Which is fine, which can lead to beautiful things. Okay, but if I'm a skeptic, I will ask questions. I'll say why. And now, so as I was saying before, faith does mean that there is an unarticulated shastra in your subconscious, in your body. All right. But for a skeptic, skepticism demands articulation. Then you need to ask questions in language. Language comes into play. Okay. And once you have language, but then again, the irony is that asking questions about music, talking about music, which is such a different medium, through language is very difficult. And that is where metaphors come into play. To answer your question about metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if you want to get really, really meta-discursive, really meta about this and really abstract about this, then it is, we may not have time to get into this in depth right now, but it is possible to make the claim, as some scholars do, that Shastra itself is a metaphor. In the sense that I make a certain sound. Okay. Ata, sa re ga ga ma re ga sa re. हे काहीतरी मी आपला बेसुरा गायलो समजा. Okay, but this chalan, if someone who has learnt Hindustani music hears this phrase, this movement, they will say, okay, this sounds like nut, this sounds like rag chhaya nut. But for you, perhaps, if you haven't learnt music, this just sounds like some melody to you.
Yeah.
Okay. You haven't given it a name. You haven't put it in a category. Right? You haven't articulated it in that sense. Okay. Now, who's to say whether this melody is a rag or not? Who's to say whether this melody has a grammar or not? Right? So you are imposing a certain articulation upon musical sound, what is essentially musical sound, which scholars have argued is a metaphorical exercise. Okay? Hey, zara
sorry, are you trying to suggest that articulation is also labeling?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we like to say very often, words are categories. Like, for example, when I say that you are a man, what is man? So on the face of it, it's a very simple question. You are a man, fine. But what does that mean? Man is a category. It's not just a noun, right? You have a whole discipline called gender studies that comes out of that simple statement. So what is it to be a man? How do you define that? What do you mean by you? Are, what is it to be? So you have ontology and epistemology that comes out of this. You can break down literally every word in any sentence, and once you think about it, you start realizing that words are categories. And there is nothing stopping you from questioning those categories. So this is what I mean by skepticism demands. So skepticism, I'm asking questions now. If I tell you you're a man and you accept me, you take my word for it, like most people do, then fine. That ends the conversation.
यू टेक माय वर्ड फॉर इट. इथेच आलं
Yeah,
सगळं.
see, exactly.
इनफॅक्ट मला आवडेल की इफ पीपल गो अँड लिसन टू गणेश देवीज
Yes.
talk which I did, and he sort of, there were two theories, I think by Bharatrhari and one more person, where म्हणजे परा, पश्यंती, मध्यमा आणि वैखरी,
Right.
त्याच्या उगम कुठून आहे आणि मग like whether word comes first or whether the sound comes first. Interesting. अच्छा, आता मला मे बी ते ऐकून I'll absorb this again. Interesting. Yeah.
So no, so I mean, to come back to what I was saying, so the minute you want to ask questions, our mode of questioning something most often is through language, and that is where scholarship comes into play, music research comes into play. Because you have something that is so powerful, a medium like music that is so powerful, that moves people. People go to such great lengths to learn music, to study it, to understand it, to listen to it. And then you feel the need to talk about it in words, in language, right? And that is kind of the beginning of academics. I mean, classical musicians are often asked ki shastra hai kai, tumhi shastra gyun basla hai. What is there in your music that demands so much thought and so much grammar and so much explanation? Okay. And often the thought is that this is a very human thing that we do. We make art, we perform any kind of art, and we think about it. We theorize using language. So this nexus where art and language meet is where scholarship and research resides. I mean,
very interesting. Yeah. Actually, तू just start केलं की sort of फेथ आणि स्केप्टिसिझम, थोडंसं स्पिरिच्युअलिटी मध्ये पण हे दोन मार्ग आहेत ना, एक भक्ती मार्ग आणि एक ज्ञान मार्ग. भक्तीमध्ये यू जस्ट फॉलो, यू जस्ट हॅव लाईक यू सरेंडर अँड यू फॉलो इट, अँड ज्ञान मे यू क्वेश्चन. इंटरेस्टिंग. तर मग मी थोडा कॉन्ट्रोवर्शियल विचारू शकतो इकडे, माहित नाही मला इफ आय एम सॉर्ट ऑफ कॉम्पिटंट इनफ टू इव्हन आस्क. मग जेव्हा कोणी दुर्गा गातंय तर few sort of musicians claim that they see Durga or they create Durga, or even दरबारी, म्हणजे तो दरबार दिसतो. तर तो मग त्या फेथमुळे दिसतो का खरंच काही, डू दे मीट बेसिकली स्केप्टिक्स अँड सॉर्ट ऑफ फेथ वाले भेटतात पुढे जाऊन कुठे?
That's a tough one, but I'll put it like this. See, what is being created is an object of art. Okay. There is a saying that I really like, which is that art is a half-truth. Okay? It half belongs to the person who creates it, and the other half has to be filled in by the person who receives it. Okay? त्यामुळे मी जर दुर्गा गात असताना माझ्या डोक्यात बॉम्बेची लोकल आहे आणि तो माझा दुर्गा ऐकत असताना तुमच्या डोक्यात दुर्गा देवी आली, so that's fine. Neither of us have control over that. There's an anecdote. A very famous poet heard the music of a very famous singer and wrote a poem about it. And when the singer read that poem, she said की ही तुमची कविता माझं गाणं ऐकून लिहिलेली, तुमची कविता मला कळली नाही. तर the poet said की तुम्हाला कळावी म्हणून मी लिहिलीच नव्हती. So what she sang, how it was received by the poet, what the poet's response to that was, and how that response was received by the singer is not a circular journey. It's a linear trajectory. It's gone in a whole other direction.
इंटरेस्टिंग. इनफॅक्ट मला मी धनश्री लेलेन बरोबर एक ऑडिओ म्हणजे एक एपिसोड केलेला. त्याच्यामध्ये त्या म्हणाल्या की कुमारजी आय थिंक भोपाळमध्ये होते कुठेतरी, आणि संध्याकाळी मेहफिल होती आणि सकाळी एका सोनाराकडे गेले आणि की बाबा काय नवीन काय आलेत, नवीन दागिने सांग. आणि त्यांनी दाखवले, काही नवीन बांगड्या आल्या आहेत, काही मंगळसूत्र वगैरे बघितलं. तर त्यांनी एक बांगडी घेतली आणि खूप वेळ बघत होते. आणि मग नंतर तो माणूस संध्याकाळी जेव्हा मेहफिल ऐकला तेव्हा तो बोलला की ते कंगनवा मोरा म्हणून, हा, तर ती जी बंदिश त्यांनी म्हणजे उभी केली ती त्या बांगडीहून खूप सुंदर होती. तर आय थिंक इथे फेथ येत आहे खूप ठिकाणी. म्हणजे मे बी त्यांना पण पटलं नसेल किंवा ते बोलले असेल ठीक आहे तुला दिसली तर दिसली.
नाही. सो दिस इज अ फेमस अॅनेक्डोट अबाउट कुमारजी. आणि खरं म्हणजे, आणि ते सो माझ्या बाबांनी मला ह्या अॅनेक्डोटबद्दलची सांगितलेली गोष्ट अशी की ते कंगन बघून, ते जेव्हा पाहिलं त्यांनी जडाऊ काम केलेलं कंगन, ते म्हणाले आता मला समजलं की माझ्या खजिन्यातली जी बंदिश आहे कंगनवा मोरा, त्या बंदिशीची गंमत मला ते कंगन पाहून समजली.
अच्छा,
बिकॉज द
उलट.
सिच्युएशन इन दॅट बंदिश इज की त्या 2 लहान मुली भांडतायत ओ द कंगन, आणि ती म्हणते की माझं कंगन मला परत दे, तर तिची मैत्रीण म्हणते की नाही देणार, जा. तर ती म्हणते की मी आता कशी घरी जाऊ. सो वाय इज दिस कंगन, व्हॉट इज द बिग डील अबाउट दिस कंगन. तर ते म्हणाले की ते बघून मला समजलं की अरे काय छान आहे. आणि आता केदार रागातली बंदिश आहे, 3 तालातली ही. So once Kumarji or whoever starts singing this bandish, after a point it is Kedar in 3 tal. And what magnificence or what beauty or what subtlety you can erect in that music, in that melody and in that rhythm. Okay? Because it's an improvised music. तुम्ही राग आणि ताल गाताय, बंदिश गाताय. आणि by bandish I mean the melodic structure of the bandish. पण जाता जाता, if the text of the bandish means something to you, then that has a very significant effect on your rendition of the bandish. आता being able to describe right now to you ki what exactly that effect was, how it changed Kumarji's rendition of that bandish, will again push me into the zone of articulation. I'll have to use metaphor, I'll have to cook up some vocabulary in order to talk to you about it. But this is actually one of the beauties of the world of art. What will connect with what, where and how. कुठे पारंपरिक एक केदार राग 3 ताल, कुठे कोणीतरी त्याच्यात बांधलेली कंगनवा मोरा ही बंदिश 2 मुलींच्या भांडण्यावरची, तिथे कुठे कुमार गंधर्व येतात, त्यांना ते कंगन कुठेतरी दिसतं, दॅट हॅज सम इफेक्ट ऑन हिज रेंडिशन ऑफ इट, अँड ऑल ऑफ दिस कम्स टुगेदर टू क्रिएट दॅट परफॉर्मन्स. सो इट्स वंडरफुल कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी.
फॅसिनेटिंग. इनफॅक्ट ज्याच्यामुळे एक नाईस सेगवे मिळतो माझ्या नेक्स्ट सॉर्ट ऑफ क्वेश्चनला की and I think you spoke about this at Talking with Tradition also, which sort of sparked my curiosity, is म्हणजे परत आता हे तो भक्ती मार्ग किंवा जो फेथ बेस्ड आहे त्याच्यामध्ये कदाचित मान्यता हा शब्द असेल, आणि मग कुमारजींसारखा कोणीतरी येऊन चॅलेंज करतो. तर इफ यू कॅन जस्ट टॉक अ लिटल बिट अबाउट मान्यता अँड ॲक्च्युली थोडंसं आपण परत पहिलं जाऊ शास्त्र आणि सॉर्ट ऑफ सायंटिफिकली सायन्स आपण बोललो ना.
Let's talk about that, right? So this has a long history, so I'm going to read 5-7 minutes to go into this a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. So how do you translate Shastra? Does Shastra mean science? Does it mean theory? What does it mean? Ektar, all of these terms tend to change their connotations as they're used in different times. So the term science, okay, Ektar, when it was used, say 100 years ago during colonial times, when people like Bhatkhande did their work, Teva Bhatkhande wanted to create a Shastra. He wanted to find, first of all, a Shastra for this music. When he couldn't find a satisfactory one in the old texts, he tried to create one. Karan, he could not accept this largely colonial accusation की तुमचं जे आत्ताचं म्हणजे तेव्हाचं जे गायलं वाजवलं जाणारं संगीत आहे, म्युझिक दॅट इज ॲक्च्युली बीइंग मेड, has no Shastra, has no science. It is unscientific. This was sort of the accusation that got made in colonial times on our music. Now, unscientific science. So science at the time basically meant organization, discipline and methodical work, some kind of tangible structure. Okay. You also have to remember that the way we think of science today is drastically different, because we are all aware of how science has evolved dramatically over the last decades.
इनफॅक्ट मला याच्यामध्ये सॉरी टू इंटरप्ट, याच्यामध्ये ऍड करावं लागेल की सायन्सच्या एपिस्टोमॉलॉजीमध्ये पण गेलं तर तो सी पासून येतो, सी विच इज टू कट. ऍक्च्युली म्हणजे इनफॅक्ट सिझर्स पण तिकडनंच आलेलं आहे. इट इज टू बेसिकली डायसेक्ट. तर आत्ता करंट टाइम मध्ये म्हणजे तुम्ही ज्या पिरियडचं बोलतोय त्या पिरियडमध्ये तर बरंच कॉनोटेशन चेंज झालंय. सायन्स म्हणजे फक्त ग्रुपिंग आणि पिरियडिक टेबलमध्ये गोष्टी टाका.
सो विच इज अगेन ऑर्गनायझेशन, राईट?
ऑर्गनायझेशन.
आणि आता काय झालं, सायन्स हॅज बिकम व्हेरी व्हेरी स्पेशलाइज्ड. आय मीन यू हॅव अ मिलियन ब्रांचेस ऑफ सायन्स, ईच ऑफ विच आर सो स्पेशलाइज्ड, राईट? बट आय मीन फॉर एक्झाम्पल द टर्म फिलॉसॉफी. There was a time, and not too long ago, I mean 200-300 years is nothing considering the spans of time humanity has been around, right? Yeah. But not so long ago, the term philosophy was an umbrella term for any kind of study, right? Philosophy, philosophia, the love for knowledge. That's what philosophy means. So natural sciences, this and that, medical sciences, all were under that umbrella term. And haru philosophy lost ground as each of these fields became more and more specialized. And I mean, I'm not a philosopher. I have been in the company of philosophers recently while doing my PhD, so this is all overheard information, so I might be wrong about this. But I believe philosophy now has basically boiled down to language, right? Articulating the human experience of things in language. Because every discipline and sub-discipline that philosophy used to deal with has become so specialized now that philosophers, what they do now is basically articulate the human experience in language, right? I may be completely wrong about this, but this is how I understand it. So science is like that. So when someone like Bhatkhande or his contemporaries in those times say they want a scientific music, what they mean is an organized music, right? And where does this desire come from? So as I mentioned in Talking with Tradition, what colonial musicologists, these Orientalists who came at the time, found was that the music they heard around them obviously was very foreign, very alien to them, very unlike European music that they were used to, and they couldn't make sense of it. So त्यांचा असा समज झाला की these people ना ते तिथल्या तिथे काहीतरी करतात. It's very random because it's improvised, right? So they couldn't find the logic behind it, so they assumed there was no logic to it. Also, on the other hand, colonial musicology starts basically with the figure of William Jones, who is this 18th century very, very important figure in Indology, musicology, ethnomusicology, very central figure. And I won't go into William Jones's history, but basically polyglot linguist, judge, sent to India in order to study the various dharma granthas of the various religions and sub-religions and sects and castes and all that of India, so that he could create a sort of a set of legal systems. And that's how he was a polyglot. He knew Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit. He studied Sanskrit in India. And in the process of studying Sanskrit literature, he read various ancient texts on music that were written in Sanskrit. Now, the texts he was reading were ancient Sanskrit texts, and the music that they described did not exist around him. It wasn't there, right? Because the music that was being heard around him was a very rich confluence of various cultures that had come in by then. So it had moved very far away from what was described in the texts. So this guy, he was reading these texts and he could not hear that music, but he assumed that this is the authentic music of this land. And there is a political bias there at play as well. William Jones was the person who first made the connection between Latin and Sanskrit. So Ashwa, Matru, Pitru, these terms, the root words are common between Sanskrit and Latin, right? So that branch of study moved forward, and then later, now, like for example, now it is well accepted that there was an original common language which is now called Proto-Indo-European, from which these languages are derived, vagara, vagara. So this starts with William Jones. So William Jones and his successors, basically they tried to say that there is a common Aryan culture at play here, right? Which is where these languages, Latin and Sanskrit and related languages also come from. And therefore, if language is common, then culture must be common. And therefore, music must be common. So they obviously found European classical music, which we all know is written down on staff notation. It's pre-composed and then played off the score sheet, right? That's the bias, that's the background that these people were coming from. And when they read these Sanskrit texts, you read anything about any music off of a text, if it's properly written, you will feel that, Arey wow, this is so beautifully organized. This is so methodical. This has a solid shastra, solid science, to use the term as it was used then, in place. And so he assumed that this is very similar to European music. It's as methodical as the European music we are used to and we hold in high esteem. And therefore, this must be the original music of this land that they have now lost. Right? And he was not able to see and grasp the beauty in the music that was being played around him. Okay, he and his successors.
सॉरी परत इंटरप्ट करायला, पण मी इथे म्हणजे मी थोडंफार अशोक रानडे ऐकत होतो आणि ते तर म्हणजे 800 वर्ष आधी जात आहेत आणि मग त्यांना कुठनं हे टेक्स्ट मिळत होते. मग म्हणजे समजा विल्यम जोन्सला हे मिळालं नाही 200-300 वर्षापूर्वी, तर मग यांना कुठनं मिळालं? वॉज ही नॉट?
विलियम जोन्सना मिळालं ना. दीज आर द सेम टेक्स्ट बेसिकली दॅट विलियम जोन्स वाज रिफरिंग टू.
But then Ashok Ranade interprets it slightly differently.
No, I'm actually quoting from Ashok Ranade. So I am just reading this book, which is Indology and Ethnomusicology by Ashok Ranade. So this is exactly what he says.
Okay.
So there isn't really a conflict there. So now that this was the case, these guys, these colonial musicologists, they gave us a sort of an inferiority complex, to put it a little crudely. They said की तुमच्या संगीतामध्ये शास्त्र नाही आहे, तुमचं डिसऑर्गनाइज भलतंच काहीतरी आहे, आमच्याकडे शास्त्र आहे. अँड ॲज वी ऑल नो, दे सेड, द colonialists said this about various Indian arts. I mean, Macaulay, I think it was, who famously said that the entire literature of the subcontinent is equivalent to not even worthy of one shelf of the Oxford libraries and stuff like that. William Jones was actually not one of these guys. He was actually very, very sympathetic to Indian culture. He held Indian literature in a very high regard. So he was actually not one of these guys. But still, I mean, the biases were still at play. Right? So then enter someone like Bhatkhande, who cannot digest this, because he knows the music. He's a scholar of the music. All right. Bhatkhande ji was never a performer as such, but if you read Professor Devdhar's article on him, you'll see how Devdharji describes that he really knew the music, and the way he could elaborate a rag was something incredible. So he obviously couldn't digest this idea that there is no logic to this music. This is such incredible music. How can this be? So he sets out in search of a Shastra. He reads all these ancient texts, but he discovers to his dismay that these ancient texts and the current music of the time, there is no connection between them. So now what to do? So he searches here and there. He travels to South India to try to make a connection through South Indian music, but he can't do that either. That fails. So he ends up creating a science, a Shastra. He writes it himself. And this is a very famous story, how he writes Srimal Lakshya Sangeetam, a book in Sanskrit, and then a commentary on it in Marathi, which is his Sangeet Paddhati. And he doesn't disclose that he is in fact the author of Srimal Lakshya Sangeetam, his Sanskrit book, which is again a very interesting approach to Shastra, because what is Shastra? Again, from where does Shastra get its authority? If I tell you something, why would you trust me? Yeah. Right? But if you have something that is printed, therefore stable and cannot change, uske upar se printed in Sanskrit, a language that is fundamentally held in such high regard, then फिर तो होगा भैया. You know, ऐसे हो जाता है.
जबरदस्त. इंटरेस्टिंग. प्रिंट आता तो मला इनफॅक्ट काहीतरी अजून एक पॅटर्न दिसतो इकडे. प्रिंट, पॉलिटिकल नॅरेटिव्ह, यांनीच सगळं चेंज होतं लाईफ.
Absolutely. No, so that's why, and again, so see so this is where academics comes in. You know, looking at these anecdotes, these things that we know from history and complicating them, problematizing them, digging nuance out of them, right? Where did print come from? Print came from colonial modernity. Yeah. Right? Who set up the printing presses? Where did this whole culture of printing and publishing at a mass scale come from? Right? So there are people who've done...
सगळ्यात पहिले तर बायबलच छापली.
Oh, right. So, I mean, culture works in very, very complex ways, as we can see. So, Bhatkhande does this. He prints this stuff. And if someone asks him, कि पंडित जी आप ये... he tells someone कि इस राग में ऐसे ऐसे होता है, इसका रूल ये है, इसका ग्रामर ये है. And the musician says कि पण पंडित जी हे तुम्हाला कुठून मिळालं? On what basis are you saying this? He would say, हे बघा, शास्त्रात लिहिलंय. हे शास्त्र त्यांनीच लिहिलं होतं. Right? Bhatkhande was a lawyer, by the way, which makes a lot of sense. Right? I mean, smart man, obviously. So that's what he did. And he published this Shastra, and he also anthologized, canonized, printed a collection of compositions, bandishes, which is the other great work that he did. Almost 2,000, 1900 odd compositions. He collected from various places. Acha, you have to remember, Bhatkhande was doing this like more than 100 years ago. Yeah. So there was no internet, forget internet, there was no Xerox machines, you know, so you had to physically travel. Bhatkhande was not a rich fellow. So you had to physically travel to obscure libraries, kuthe zaun, hand copy stuff. So it's a whole other methodology that you had to adopt at the time. And he does this, and he has an editorial team of musicians in place. He'll collect 10 different versions of a single bandish, and he'll write down all the versions of it, he'll notate it, then with all the musicians they'll go over each of the versions and then debate and discuss and come to one final version, which he will then print. But the point I will make about this, that I made at Talking with Tradition also, is that with the best of intentions in mind, Bhatkhande is curating the tradition, he's reshaping it, he's giving it his own twist. Because in an exercise as complicated as this, that traditional material whose authenticity you are trying to capture, you are inevitably changing it. How can you not? I mean, you could even make the argument that Hindustani music is so fluid. Ragrupa, Bandishi, these are so fluid. They are not meant to be notated. They are meant to keep changing with time. You can argue, you can make a case like that. So you can also make the case that Bhatkhande was doing a disservice to the tradition by fixing it. Or you could alternatively say that no, he's doing a great service to the tradition by creating a base for you to work off of.
Wow, amazing. I think मी झाकीर हुसेनचा एक इंटरव्ह्यू ऐकत होतो, त्याच्यात बोलला की आपल्याला खरंच 100-200 वर्ष मागे गेलं तर काहीच माहित नाही, सगळे हायपोथिसिस आहेत.
Hypothesis it.
सगळे सुंदर.
But in the same breath, I will also say ki, I mean, I don't mean to sort of call you out on this, but unfortunately, आपल्याकडे जे universities, I mean, I'm sorry to bring this up, ही negative गोष्ट आहे थोडीशी, पण unfortunately this is the case, की music studies जे at the university level with most PhD students and all जे करण्यात येतं, त्याच्यामध्ये this tends to be used as an excuse. की if you go back 200 years, सगळे hypotheses आहेत, आपल्याला काही सांगताच येत नाही, there's nothing you could really say, this music is too great, so you end up doing nothing. But that is also not true. There is a lot of excellent research work that you can do if you take the trouble to do it. But we'll come to that a little later when we come to research. But I'll just sort of conclude by saying this. So, Bhatkhande created a Shastra. And this itself is such an interesting phenomenon because when we say Shastriya Sangeet, the connotation that we take for granted is that this is some ancient Shastra. Right? That is authentic because it is ancient. But here you have something barely 100 years ago, literally creating it. Of course, you can make the argument that he was creating it based on something that was ancient. So you can argue all sorts of things, but the fact remains that Bhatkhande created what we now consider Shastra. Right? So then what is Shastriya Sangeet? What is classical? So digging into these ideas is one way to approach academics.
करेक्ट. आणि ग्लॅड दॅट यू सेड इन दी एंड की दॅट्स अन अकॅडमिक प्रॅक्टिस, कारण नॉर्मलमध्ये तर पॅटर्न बघता आला तरी सॉर्ट ऑफ कुठे काय इंटेंट होता तेवढा कळला की यू कॅन स्टार्ट ऑन युअर ओन ऑल्सो. इंटरेस्टिंग. या सो सेकंड वन वॉट आय वॉन्टेड टू आस्क वॉज मान्यता. तर ॲक्च्युली यू टच अपॉन मल्टिपल थ्रेड्स देअर, पण म्हणजे आता शास्त्र मान्य केलं का मान्यता हॅज अ डिफरंट कॉनोटेशन, आणि मग कॅन मान्यता बी सिस्टमॅटिकली स्टडीड? Actually, you have answered it pretty much.
No, but I mean, that's a very good question, and there's more that can be said about it. You know?
Yeah.
So let me come to it from a slightly different perspective, and this is something I've recently become a little passionate about because this is a perspective I was introduced to in my recent years of PhD study. So far, up until before I started my PhD, I was lucky to be able to do my PhD at a wonderful place, the Manipal Centre for Humanities, which is populated with really incredible scholars who basically taught me to read and write all over again. By which I mean ki what it is to really close read a text, what is it to ask good questions, you know, how can you pursue those questions, how can you ask better questions, hopefully search for some answers. So in the process, I was introduced to, so before I did this, before I got into my PhD, I was a student of music. Okay, I was learning performance from my guru. My teacher, my father, Pandit Srijan Deshpande, happens to be a slightly hatke musician in the sense that he's also an archivist, he's a musicologist, he's a scholar in his own right in a very different...
Plus Kumar Gandharva.
Yes, exactly. You know, so this whole... so I grew up in this whole atmosphere of skepticism and questioning and thinking about it, articulating it and all of that. But it was still rooted in a performative idiom, right? When I did my PhD, I was expected to do a really long literature review. 6 months I had to basically sit down, shut up and read. Because one key advice that my advisor, Dr. Nikhil Govind, gave me was basically sit down and read and identify what are the debates in your field. What are the scholars in your field arguing about? What do they disagree about? What do they agree about? Right? And as you do that, you will find your own research question. You'll realize that nothing has been said about this that I have at the back of my mind. Or wait a minute, I don't agree with what is being said. Or okay, there is a certain rude, accepted understanding about something that I agree with or I don't agree with. And then you can start addressing that gap. Okay, so this exercise that I engaged in, and as I was doing this, I read a lot of Western ethnomusicological work on Hindustani music that I was not familiar with, that I hadn't read much before. And now, because I was doing it in the context of my PhD, I had to read it really seriously. And one interesting thing that I found was that the discipline of ethnomusicology is basically it's an interdiscipline, right? Because these guys are trained in disciplines like history, historiography, anthropology, sociology, and they come to music from that background. And they're also they take training or are trained in the music that they are studying, right? So I'll give you an example to give you a stark example of how ethnomusicology works very differently from what we consider musicology, right? A well-known scholar called Daniel Newman, in the 1970s, he lived in Delhi, and he wrote a sociology of the music communities in Delhi at the time. And one of the opening statements in his book, which is called The Life of Music in North India, one of his opening statements is that I am not interested in the great musicians. I'm not interested in the stars. I'm interested in the ecosystem which gives birth to these stars. The ecosystem that produces musicians, whether they're stars or not. But what is the community within which music functions? What are the social dynamics inside that community? How do they earn their bread and butter? What religions, castes, languages, geographies, habits, etc. do they have? Who are these people? So he laid out probably the first sociology of Hindustani music, centered around Delhi in a very particular period of time in the 1970s, So this opened up a window for me, and I realized that, wow, we think of music as this sublime, otherworldly thing. Our day-to-day talk about music is ki this thought gives rise to this rag, and this rag gives rise to that rag, and these two rags mix up to give rise to a third rag, and this and that, as if this is all happening in the air somewhere, but hada masachi manasa hai kartayat. These are people. Who are these people? How it's an art, right? Music is, on the one hand, we'll say music is expression. It's an expression of your being, of yourself, and all of that. But then how can your political, social, cultural, linguistic background not have an effect on your music? It must. Right? And very often, we are a little hesitant to look at these aspects of a musician's life. It's almost considered badtamizi. I felt this hesitation myself. It's like looking into their window.
You're actually demystifying the whole thing. Yeah.
And we don't like, as lovers of music, as people who idolize these great musicians, we don't like very often to think of them as just human beings. We want them to be gods. But that is exactly the opposite of what the academic idiom demands of you. It demands that you think of them as people with pros and cons, with greatnesses and faults. Right? And more than greatnesses and faults, people who are products of a particular moment in history, rooted in a particular geography or geographies, in a particular sociology, and then teasing out, unraveling the links between all of these worlds that they inhabit, is what ethnomusicology tries to do. Ethnomusicology, by definition, tries to use music as a medium to talk about culture. Whereas what I wanted to do was the opposite, because I was more interested in the music. But at the least, I learned not to ignore the culture and the sociology and the politics of it. So, since we were talking about manyata, we talk about classical music, right? Now, I'll give you an example, and I'm quoting from a couple of Western ethnomusicological scholars, Harold Powers and Peter Manuel, just to give you names. How do you approach the term classical from a sociological point of view? It's very interesting. So just to give you an example. So classical music. Okay, Shastriya Sangeet. But what is classical? So Harold Powers has tried to say in this paper to define the term classical in terms of various musics from across the world that are called classical music. And he finds, through a comparative analysis of these classical musics, that there are some things that are common to them all. One, these are all musics that are practiced by specialists who claim to be specialists of this music.
Okay.
Number two, they are appreciated by people who call themselves connoisseurs.
Okay.
रसिकर्स. आम्ही ह्याचे बारकावे, आम्हाला समजतं, तुम्हाला समजत नाही, आम्हाला समजतं, असं म्हटलं जातं ना शास्त्रीय संगीताबद्दल. Number three, there is an explicit theory that is very often written down. What the theory is, whether it is sophisticated or not, how sophisticated is a whole other question. But there is an articulated theory. Okay. And there are a few more which I may not be able to recall right now. But now if you look at these criteria, they're not about the music at all. They're about the society that practices this music. And it made a lot of sense to me.
करेक्ट.
And
नाही,
now,
मला पण
sorry,
सॉरी नाही, मला पण इकडे म्हणजे काही अभ्यासक नाहीये किंवा मला काही नॉलेज पण नाहीये जास्ती, पण वॉट एव्हर आय कुड सॉर्ट ऑफ कनेक्ट वॉज अगेन बिकॉज आय कम फ्रॉम दॅट लिटल ज्ञानवाला स्कूल. माय डेफिनेशन वॉज ऑफ क्लासिकल वॉज विच वॉज लाईक practiced every day. That's how I define classical.
Yes,
Riyaz.
that is in fact how one of the criteria that powers, if I'm not mistaken, lays. Extensive training, not so much practice, but people who go through extensive, practitioners of these musics go through extensive training for extensive, like आपल्याकडे म्हणतात ना एक तप गुरुगृही राहावं लागतं 12 years, that kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So now coming back to manyata, because this is a society that functions like this, okay, and of course it has been called an elitist society, which is not entirely incorrect. It is true also, but I mean there's a lot there that we can go into perhaps. But imagine now that there is a small group of people, and obviously this is going to be a small group of people, as opposed to people who listen to Bollywood music. I don't mean to say that one music is superior, one is inferior. That is not my point. I'm talking about sheer scale. The scale at which Bollywood music, popular music is consumed cannot be compared to the scale at which classical music is consumed. It's okay. Now, so there is a small group of people. Atta in 2022, it's a slightly different world. The number of people who listen to classical music at whatever level of understanding is vastly more now than it used to be not so long ago. Okay. But for sake of argument, let's say there is a small group of people who are very invested in khayal music. Say for example, त्याच्यात सुद्धा घराणी आहेत. So in a particular brand of khayal music making. And असं होतं एका जमान्यामध्ये की the other घराणाs are all waste, my daddy is strongest, mine is the only one that is valid. That kind of thing. But समजा there's a small group of people. आता there is a musician who these people admire, or a set of musicians that these people admire, and they say that this is true music. This is essential music. This is what music is really about. Other kinds of music are frivolous. They're superficial. They don't have this depth or this breadth or this rigor or whatever it is. Okay. आता ह्याच्यामध्ये काय होतं? Two things happen. One, broadly speaking, one is that there is the opportunity to take a very small niche subject area and really dive deep into it, which can reveal tremendous insights. Okay. On the other hand, the converse of that is a lot can get left out.
Correct.
Right. So as a case, let's think about, say, a set of musicians and a community, a tightly knit community around it, okay, which gives a lot of precedence, say, to tunefulness, to सुरीलापन. गाणं सुरेल 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 इतकं सुरेल असलं पाहिजे की आहा डोळ्यात पाणी आलंच पाहिजे. Okay. At the cost though, because their focus is entirely in this one direction, they might lose out on a command of rhythm or a command of musical structure or perhaps of text.
Yeah.
And you often find this in musicians who are very, very surila, okay, that you can't understand the words they're saying.
मला आमिर खान कळत नाहीत.
I mean, there are lots of examples you could give. But त्यांचा आता Amir Khan is an example of someone who, for all his other greatnesses, he's not singing text. He's not that invested in text. Abdul Karim Khan Sahab, or would be an even more prominent example of something like this. Amir Khan, as compared to Abdul Karim Khan Sahab, Amir Khan साहेबांचे शब्द कळतात बऱ्यापैकी. और अशी उदाहरणं अनेक आपण देऊ शकतो. So, but the people who are devout followers of this music and this set of people, they won't find that missing. Because their satisfaction, their expectations are met. They find tremendous joy. They might find salvation in that music. Okay. Ata this is where someone like, and this happens, so मी सुरेलपणाचं उदाहरण दिलं.
सर मी सॉरी परत एक कट करीन. आय एम फिलिंग व्हेरी बॅड टू कट यू, कारण चांगला फ्लो मिळतोय. पण आय थिंक आय गॉट वेर युअर पॉइंटिंग टू की ती जी सॉर्ट ऑफ डेप्थमध्ये जाऊन एक सिलेक्ट 15 लोक 50 लोक 100 लोकांना जे पाहिजे होतं ते मिळालं आणि मग त्यांनी ते मान्य केलं की छान. इज दॅट करेक्ट?
एक्झॅक्टली. दिस इज वे मान्यता. सो मी सुरेलपणाचं उदाहरण दिलं. आता लयदारी, लयचं काम करणे, लय 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 लय, इतकी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड लय किंवा इतका कमांड लयवर की सुराकडे लक्ष नाही, किंवा शब्दांकडेच लक्ष आणि गाण्याकडे कमी लक्ष, किंवा काही असू शकतं. दे कॅन बी व्हेरियस डिरेक्शन्स दिस कॅन टेक. बट सुर अँड लय आर टू पोलर एक्स्ट्रीम्स, टू पोलर ऑपोजिट्स. दॅट इज एन एक्झाम्पल दॅट इज ऑफन गिव्हन. ओके. आता नाव समवन लाईक कुमार गंधर्व विल कम अलॉंग अँड से की नाही, मला एक होलिस्ट संगीत तयार करायचं आहे. सो कुमारजींचं वाक्य असं आहे की आत्तापर्यंत आपल्या संगीतात पूर्ण मूर्ती कोणी घडवलेली नाही. अप्रतिम मूर्ती तयार केली पण नाकच विसरून गेले, डोकंच नाही त्याला. हां. सो माय एम, कुमारजी वुड से, इज टू डू दिस, टू क्रिएट अ पूर्ण मूर्ती. आता हाऊ सक्सेसफुल ही वॉज वगैरे इज अ होल अदर क्वेश्चन. Okay, but this is what his ambition was. Again, I would like to, I have to qualify this as an academic, and honestly, I mean genuinely, I don't want to be a proselytizer of Kumarji's music and say that he did achieve this and his music was a crest, because I genuinely do not believe that that is the case. Okay, and I'll tell you a simple proof of the fact that this is not the case is that there are so many people who don't like Kumarji's music.
Yeah.
So obviously it is not
in fact polar आहेत, आवडतं नाही तर म्हणजे नाहीच आवडत, म्हणजे असं ऐकणारच नाही.
That is why Kumarji is such an interesting figure, and that's what prompted me to write a dissertation on him, because there's a set of people who can listen to only Kumarji and no one else.
Yeah.
And then there is a set of people who can listen to anyone but Kumarji. He elicited such an extreme response. Okay. But his thrust, his attempt was to create this holism where he tried to create a balance pana, kiwa he tried, okay, but let's come to that later. But so manyata shabd te je vapartat is in this context. So he says की कोणीतरी फार अप्रतिम राग मांडतोय, अप्रतिम बंदिश मांडतोय, खूप छान लयीचं काम करतोय, पण सुरातच नाहीये, आवाज सुरात लागतच नाही,
आणि मग ती मान्यता
आणि तरी लोक वावा देतात, क्या बात आहे म्हणतात, तर ही मान्यता दिली गेली.
आणि ही बिकॉज अगेन म्हणजे मला तर परत पॉलिटिक्स दिसतंय यात, कारण ते घराण्यांचं पॉलिटिक्स येते आणि दे आर जस्ट लाईक they are saying this is it, right? We have arrived and this is it.
Certainly, and I just like to qualify that by saying politics is not necessarily a bad thing. So when we are saying politics, we are not saying it in the negative sense. Politics is a part of life.
Yeah.
It's, see, having a bias, having a prejudice is a very human thing.
Correct.
There's nothing, it's not a criminal act. Right? That's why I'm looking at manyata. See, now someone like Kumar Gandharva has the authority to come and say ki tumhi manyata deta, mi nahi denar, mi kaitari. He was a prodigy, he was in another league. We are mere mortals, so आपल्यासाठी but what is possible for us though is to try to understand this in as liberal and as wide a sense as possible. Okay? And basically मला ना म्हणजे मला स्वतःचं सांगतो, कुमारजींवर प्रेम आहेच, आय कम फ्रॉम दॅट ट्रेडिशन, बट संगीतकार या फिनॉमिनावरच मला खूप प्रेम वाटतं, मला आपुलकी वाटते की अरे someone is trying to make music, that in itself is a beautiful thing. I sympathize because I try to do it myself very unsuccessfully at times. So I know how difficult it is and I know what it takes to sing one note in tune, you know. So त्यामुळे manyata is also a good thing. So you can look at manyata in two ways. In one way is what we talked about. You can look at it as indulgence, you know, or lenience. You're being lenient, you're being complacent. की हा दोष आपण खपवून घेतोय, पण जे चांगलं आहे त्याच्याकडेच लक्ष केंद्रित करतोय. बट ऑन दी अदर हँड मान्यता इज ऑल्सो अबाउट एम्पथी, की अरे एका आयुष्यात एका माणसाला सगळं करणं शक्य नाहीये, म्हणूनच तर ही मोठी कला आहे ना.
ब्युटिफुल.
वी से इट्स अन ओशन इन एव्हरीथिंग. वाय? बिकॉज इट ट्रूली इज. इट इज नॉट ह्युमनली पॉसिबल. एक दोन लोक आहेत मुश्किल से जिन्होंने ये किया. सो देन मान्यता बिकम्स अ पोटेंट टूल कि अरे बाबा ठीक है, प्रेम की बात है, प्रेम से आप उसका गाना सुनो, जो दोष है नजरअंदाज करो, अच्छा जो है वो तो सुनो कम से कम.
करेक्ट.
यु नो. सो
मला इथे एक म्हणजे थोडंसं माझं इनपुट द्यायला आवडेल, कारण मी थोडंफार स्वामी विवेकानंद वाचतोय, तर त्यांच्यामध्ये त्यांनी, आणि जस्ट फॉर द लिसनर्स, दे कांट सी दिस बट आय ट्राय अँड हेल्प यू व्हिज्युअलाइज, की तुम्ही जर असं सर्कल बनवला, दोन बोटं म्हणजे 2 पॉइंटिंग फिंगर्स टचिंग इच अदर अँड 2 थम्स टचिंग इच अदर, असा एक सर्कल बनवला, आणि जर तुम्हाला सॉर्ट ऑफ विड्थ पाहिजे असेल, जे तू म्हणत होतास की सगळं कळलं पाहिजे, तर यू हॅव टू बिकम नॅरो.
Right.
vertically, right? And if you want to go deep, then you have to become like narrow automatically. When vertically or horizontally, you have to either sort of like bring something closer. So
Can I just give rise to the academic in myself and point out that what you're doing right now is using metaphor to articulate a difficult concept in language.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
हा, तर याच्यामध्ये विवेकानंद असं बोललेले की सॉर्ट ऑफ, म्हणजे आय एम जस्ट पॅराफ्रेझिंग, जिकडे कुठे वाचलं असेल तिकडे, की सो इफ यू डोंट वॉन्ट टू बी नॅरो इन आयदर ॲक्सिस, यू हॅव टू जस्ट एक्सपॅन्ड द सर्कल इट सेल्फ.
राईट.
आणि that's what he did. That's why sort of became immortal and like living last for 100 years. I think कुमारजींनी ते ट्राय केलं असेल, मला कुठेतरी वाटतंय आता.
सो सो राईट. सो नाव आता काय करायचं? सो ऑन द वन हँड, सो वेअर इन अ व्हेरी अँबिग्युअस पोझिशन नाव, की एकीकडे मान्यता इज अ गुड थिंग ऑल्सो, इट्स अ बॅड थिंग ऑल्सो, बट देन नाव व्हॉट टू डू, यु नो. सो व्हॉट क्वेश्चन्स कॅन यू आस्क देन? रिसर्च करायचं म्हणजे काय करायचं? So then the only thing that you're left with, the only approach that you're left with, if you agree with this, is मग कोणाला काय योग्य वाटलं, कोणाला, कुठल्या कम्युनिटीला, कुठल्या लोकांना काय सुंदर वाटलं आणि का. This then becomes the most important question. Okay. So suppose even someone of the stature of Kumar Gandharva comes along and says की तुमचं गाणं इनकम्प्लीट आहे, तुम्ही फक्त मूर्ती घडवली पण डोकंच विसरून गेलात तुम्ही. So your music is incomplete. I am trying to create a complete music. Or someone else makes some other kind of accusation on some other musician and says ki this is your feeling. Okay. But if that musician who is apparently incomplete or whatever, if his music is being loved and appreciated by a certain section of society, then it is a meaningful transaction. Then the interesting question now to carry the conversation forward is ki what is this music? And why are these people liking it? So एका जमान्यामध्ये तवाईफांचं गाणं एका समाजाला प्रचंड आवडलं, and then after a certain break in history, at a certain point, people suddenly started saying की नाही हे तर अश्लील आहे सगळं. आणि आता अगेन पीपल आर सेइंग नाही हे अश्लील नव्हतं, उगाच अश्लील म्हणत होतं ह्याला, पण हे तर सुंदर होतं. सो दिस कीप्स चेंजिंग. सो व्हॉट इज इंटरेस्टिंग इज
पॉलिटिक्स आलं, कारण इंडिपेंडन्स नंतर गांधीमुळे काही ना काहीतरी चेंजेस झालेले, त्याच्यामुळे ते परत चेंज झालं. सॉरी टू
नो प्रिसाइसली, आय मीन दॅट इज एक्झॅक्टली द पॉइंट. सो मग हे पॉलिटिक्स म्हणा त्याला, किंवा ह्याला कल्चरल एव्होल्युशन म्हणा, कल्चरल चेंज म्हणूया आपण एव्होल्युशनपेक्षा, बिकॉज एव्होल्युशन इंडिकेट्स अ प्रोग्रेशन, अ लिनियर प्रोग्रेशन टुवर्ड्स समथिंग डिझायरेबल. तसं नको म्हणूयात आपण, लेट्स से चेंज, थिंग्स कीप चेंजिंग. सो व्हॉट, सो इफ people of community X in era Y enjoyed the music of these tawaifs, who are these people? What satisfaction did they derive from this music? What was the socio-cultural, political complexity jachat basun they were listening to this music? You know, this is how you can approach difficult questions like this. And the reason it is so interesting and there's so much to be said and studied is because music is like that. Music is such a see, music is sound at one level. It is at a metaphorical level, it is structure. You know, trained musicians are able to see structure and sound. But beyond this exclusively musical stuff, structure and sound and everything, music is social. Music signifies sociality. Music signifies culture. Music is linguistic. It is geographical. It is political. It says so much in so many different ways. You know, I mean, आता मी समजा असा आवाज लावला तर इट विल सिग्निफाय अ डिफरंट मूड, अ डिफरंट ॲटमॉस्फिअर, अ डिफरंट कल्चर टू यू. Whereas असा आवाज लावला तर इट विल सिग्निफाय समथिंग एंटायरली डिफरंट टू यू. You know, one mode of expression might signify eroticism or romance to you. One mode might signify spirituality or something else to you. You know, so mode of voice, articulation, enunciation, कसे तुम्ही शब्द टाकता, तुम्ही, you know, I mean, there's so much that music says. And what appeals to who then of all of what signifies what to who? It becomes. But
how does it help? I mean, say suppose you understand, say ठुमरी or ध्रुपदचा एक टाइम होता. What do you sort of, how does it, म्हणजे खूपच लूज प्रश्न असेल, नाही असेल थोडाफार, पण असतं ना की बाबा लाईक वॉटर इज मेड ऑफ H2O, राईट? तर ते कळल्यावर काहीतरी पुढे हेल्प होईल. हाऊ वेअर डज दिस हेल्प? लाईक सपोज यू इन्व्हेस्टिगेट अ घराना or a form of music or an artist.
Right.
Like where does it sort of help?
To give you two examples, let's put it from two perspectives. From the perspective of a musician, okay, if I am faced with the challenge of what music to make today, because you're talking about Hindustani music, it's an improvised music, right? So माझ्यासाठी कोणीतरी बिथोवेननी 200 वर्षांपूर्वी ते कॉम्पोजिशन लिहून ठेवलेलं नाही आहे, that I just have to reproduce, which I'm not saying is less of a challenge, because there's a whole other set of complexities that are involved in doing that. But for me as a khayal singer, there is literally the challenge की पुढच्या आवर्तनात मी काय करू? म्हणजे forget, आता for example, I mean, for listeners who are not familiar with classical music, let me put it like this. For someone like Sonu Nigam, okay, who is a singer with a very surreal singer with a beautiful voice, what is his task? His task is that, say for example, A.R. Rahman has composed a song, right? The tune is ready. Sonu Nigam has to sing it to the best of his ability and pour his soul and his expression into it. Maybe he might vary the tune a little bit, but largely, broadly, 90% of the content, the musical structure is pre-decided for him. The words are pre-decided, right? Whereas for a khayal singer, the challenge is the composition. We compose spontaneously. To what extent is again a question of scholarly study. Okay, some people are more spontaneous than others. Some people rely more on pre-composed stuff than others. But as a genre, the difference in khayal is that you have to compose spontaneously. Now, this is such a challenge. Literally, the sky is the limit. Now, I can express whatever I want. So, what do I express? Then, in order to widen my span of expressive ability, what is my homework? My homework is to study how other people have expressed. And then, if I really want to get into it, then how have other people expressed in their times? Right? Neither what happens very often is ki my guru is X, his guru is Y, his guru is Z, and it goes on, and we go straight back to Tansen, and therefore we belong to an ancient lineage, आणि आम्ही एक spiritual आमचं संगीत देवाकडे घेऊन जातं म्हणून आम्ही ते गाणार. Okay, but if you study the reality of music, if you historicize music, you will find that it's never so simple. You will find that musicians were singing in various contexts. They made the music that we like for various reasons in completely other contexts than what we imagine them to be. You know, म्हणजे लिटरली आपल्याला वाटतं की देवाची आराधना करतात पण ते कुठल्या तरी राजाला खुश करायला गात असतील. Which, and I don't mean to say that's an inferior thing. That is musical reality, and beautiful music comes out of it. You know, किंवा आपल्याला आता प्रॅक्टिकल एक्झाम्पल आपल्याला असं वाटतं की एक समज आहे हिंदुस्थानी संगीतामध्ये की चढ्या पट्टीमध्ये पुरुषांनी गायला पाहिजे. दॅट्स वन पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यू की मेन शुडंट सिंग टू लो, दे शुड बी सिंगिंग हाय. नाउ द हिस्टरी ऑफ दिस इज की बिफोर एम्प्लिफिकेशन केम अराउंड, मेल सिंगर्स यूज्ड टू सिंग वेरी हाय सिम्पली टू बी हर्ड. नाउ इफ यू नो दिस, then you can tell yourself ki, okay, I have a microphone here. I don't need to be that loud and that high. I can sing softly and do a different kind of musical expression. I can explore a different kind of subtlety through a soft voice. So these are the options that understanding the history of your form of art can open up to you. And from the other perspective, from the other side of the table, for a scholar of, say for example, Indian culture or Indian history, music becomes a very potent tool to understand the social significance of what was happening. Right? So who are these musicians? What context did they come from? What languages did they sing in? What was their music directed towards? What was the purpose? Were they singing in temples? Were they singing in courts? Were they projecting their voice in a particular way to please someone? Was it an audience? Was it a courtly patron? Was it a political move? Was it what? You know? And this, it goes on, the list goes on. I mean, did tawaifs vocalize in a certain way to express their sexuality or to suppress their sexuality because they were accused of being overly sexual? So voice studies comes in, gender studies comes in here. So there is so much that music studies can do for you.
ॲक्च्युली हां, म्हणजे अमेझिंग आहे, कारण एक ले लिसनर म्हणून ऐकणं आणि थोडंसं क्युरिओसिटीने ऐकणं मेक्स लाईक चेंजेस युअर वर्ल्ड ऑल टुगेदर.
Exactly, because it forces you to step out of your comfort zone. यु नो. आणि दुसरं काय होतं, दी अदर थिंग आय रिअली लाईक अबाउट अकॅडमिक्स इज दॅट इट मेक्स यू व्हेरी अवेअर ऑफ सो मेनी थिंग्स, यु नो, अबाउट the rich tapestry, that everything that we just spoke about. But also, and I have a particular affinity for language, and people who enjoy language are the ones who usually get into academics, because language is a big part of academics, like it or not. So it makes you very aware. Each word becomes important then. And you get used to articulating in a very specific way. Like, see, I was reading this a while ago. This scholar says, Arjun Appadurai, well-known scholar, manyata आपण जे म्हणत होतो, in the context of that. So he doesn't use the term manyata, but he's talking about the same thing. He calls it a community of sentiment, which is so beautifully put.
Beautiful.
It is a community that is connected by a certain sentiment, which sentiment can be felt for a singer, or maybe for a painter, or maybe for a monument, or a religion, or whatever it is. But it is the sentiment कि अरे हे आहे ना, हे भारी आहे, that binds that community together. But then what happens is, I'll just read, I'm just quoting from Appadurai, a community of sentiment is a community whose incumbents, the people in it, are connected to each other. How? By ties of aestheticizing privilege. So then they have the privilege to aestheticize something. So they are telling you that this is beautiful, and therefore then people in that community find it beautiful. Because someone they respect, the elders in the community, are telling you that it is beautiful. So it is privilege. Aestheticizing privilege.
Wow.
So कुमारजी एक
डेंजरस वाटतं हे ना.
हो नाही, सोप्या भाषेमध्ये कुमारजी एक अनेक्डोट सांगतात मुक्काम भाषेमध्ये, विच इज बेसिकली टॉकिंग अबाउट दिस, की आम्ही लहानपणी, कारण ही वॉज अ चाइल्ड प्रॉडिजी, राईट. सो त्यांना, आणि ते ग्रॅमोफोन रेकॉर्डची नक्कल करायचे.
करेक्ट.
आणि फ्लॉलेस नक्कल करायचे. म्हणजे नॉट ओनली नक्कल, तो गायक ज्या ढंगाने इम्प्रोवाइज करत होता रेकॉर्डमधला, तर रेकॉर्ड थांबल्यावर त्याच ढंगात ते इम्प्रोवाइज करू शकत होते. सो ही त्यांची लेवल होती. सो मग लोक काय करायची की अरे कोणाची तरी रहमत खानची नवीन रेकॉर्ड आली आहे बाजारात, चल कुमारला ऐकूया, म्हणजे मग तो गाऊन दाखवेल. सो पीपल यूज टू टेक हिम टू रेकॉर्ड शॉप्स टू लिसन टू रेकॉर्ड्स. आणि सो देन ही वॉज अ विटनेस टू दिस व्हेरी ऑफन, की काय व्हायचं की रेकॉर्ड वाजली आणि काहीतरी ते जे कोण गात होते ते खालच्या स्वराला गेले, एकदम पंचमात गेले, तर आणि सगळे म्हणाले क्या बात आहे. तर ते म्हणतात की आम्हाला मग लहानपणी असं वाटायचं का अरे वा, म्हणजे खाली गेलेलं चांगलं, खाली गेलं की लोक वावा म्हणतात, मग खाली गेलेलं चांगलं, मग खाली झालं पाहिजे, किंवा वरती गेलं, खूप वरती गेलं की लोक वावा म्हणतात, मग चांगलं. मग कुमारजी म्हणतात की असा सगळा आपल्या संगीताचा प्रवास झालेला आहे. आता कुमारजींबद्दल मला भक्तिभाव जो लहानपणापासून होता, कारण आय ग्रो अप इन दॅट ॲटमॉस्फिअर म्हणा, यु नो, किंवा ही इज दॅट काइंड ऑफ अ फिगर, तर तेव्हा मला हे वाटायचं लय भारी. बट नाव academics sobers you down a little bit, you know, and tells you that what Kumarji is saying applies to everybody, even to Kumarji himself, even to, you know, to all forms of art, because that is the empathy side of the manyata coin, right? But that said, these people who are saying ki khali gelela mujhe वाह वाह क्या बात है, they are exercising their privilege of aestheticization. ते त्याला सुंदर ठरवतायत.
इट इज डेंजरस, कारण मला हे दिसतं. आणि इनफॅक्ट त्याच्यामुळे आता कॉन्सर्ट्सला पण जायला एवढं असं वाटत नाही, कारण म्हणजे आता मागचे 5 वर्षात जे काही कॉन्सर्ट्स बघितलेत तिकडे जर ताल वाढवला तर लोक टाळ्या वाजवतात, बाकी नॉर्मल असतं. तर आय थिंक दे आर डुईंग द सेम थिंग, बिकॉज दे कांट प्रोबेबली, आय डोंट नो, आय एम नॉट लाईक लुकिंग डाऊन, बट दॅट इज व्हॉट दे अप्रिशिएट. सो दे थिंक
दॅट्स द थिंग. सो आता काय आहे की फ्रॉम द पॉइंट ऑफ व्ह्यू ऑफ अ म्युझिशियन or someone who's a die-hard lover of classical music, मला असंच वाटतं, व्हेरी ऑफन असं वाटलेलं आहे की अरे काय यार, हे कुठे दाद देत आहेत ही लोक, दिस इज नॉट वॉट म्युझिक इज अबाउट वगैरे. ओके, बट ॲज अ म्युझिक, ॲज अ लेट्स से ॲज अन अकॅडमिक, बिकॉज इवन काय होतं, एक वन प्रॉब्लेम दॅट अकॅडमिक्स क्रिएट्स, म्हणजे एक वन पिट दॅट इट थ्रोज यू इन टू, इज यू कीप गेटिंग मेटा, यू कीप गेटिंग मोर अँड मोर ॲब्स्ट्रॅक्टेड, अँड यू कीप थिंकिंग अबाउट वर्ड्स. So then musicology म्हणजे काय, ethnomusicology म्हणजे काय, then you know, so you're very careful about using these terms. So let's say academics, scholarly pursuits, okay. Once you understand the range of scholarly pursuit, of the thirst for knowledge, then everything becomes interesting. So ज्या लोकांना त्या टाळ्या घेणं घ्याव्याशा वाटतायत किंवा द्याव्याशा वाटतायत, ती लोक कोण आहेत, कुठल्या सिच्युएशनमध्ये आहेत, पुन्हा ते सगळं आलं. So that also becomes an interesting thing to investigate.
Yeah.
In what
I think-
context this is happening.
I think what is happening is because of certain pursuit of knowledge, we are expanding and that's why this acceptance is coming. म्हणजे माझ्या बाबतीत acceptance येतोय. तुमच्या बाबतीत कदाचित अजून sort of अरे हे पण इंटरेस्टिंग आहे, अभ्यास करण्यासारखं आहे. I think that's where you are coming from.
Yeah.
Cool.
Let me just sort of round that off by saying ki what you just said, ki मान्यता देतात लोक, टाळ्या वाजवतात to something that perhaps is not so meaningful. आता what is meaningful? What is meaningfulness? So this scholar whose work I really like, called Martin Clayton, he puts it so nicely. He says, I'm quoting from him, any musical event is meaningful. When? How? Insofar as it offers affordances to an individual.
Beautiful.
तुम्हाला तुमची काहीतरी गरज जर भागत असेल किंवा तुम्हाला काहीतरी स्कोप दिसत असेल स्वतःला एक्सप्रेस करायला कोणाच्या तरी संगीतामध्ये, तर तुमच्यासाठी ते मिनिंगफुल आहे. इट कॅन बी एज सिम्पल एज दॅट. नाउ ॲज अ म्युझिशियन, ॲज अ स्कॉलर ऑफ, ॲज अ प्रॅक्टिशनर, मला संगीत समजून घ्यायचं तर मग आय विल ट्राय टू गेट मोर अँड मोर सटल, to dive deeper and deeper into this. So I will try to make my need for musical meaning more and more refined. Right? And inevitably because of that, because like to use your metaphor of the circle and the point, if I'm narrowing my scope, I will lose out on other signification and other pursuits of knowledge. But that is the compromise that any scholarly pursuit has to make.
It is absolutely humbling.
Yeah.
Cool. I think आपल्याला खूप बोलता येईल. आपण परत एकदा याच्यावर बोलूया.
Sure.
We will sort of take more topics as we go along. But last एक दोन प्रश्न आहेत अजून की and this is mainly for people who are interested in music or would like to take some sort of project. So any other areas of research projects that can be undertaken in Hindustani? Obviously,
Right.
कारण एकदा लँग्वेज म्हटल्यावर सगळंच आलं. तो वन विच आय सॉर्ट ऑफ आयडेंटिफाईड इन सो फार इज दॅट यू बिल्ड अ क्वेस्ट और यू सॉर्ट ऑफ बिल्ड अ थॉट प्रोसेस ऑफ अंडरस्टँडिंग विच कम्युनिटीज, विच सॉर्ट ऑफ आर्टिस्ट, त्यांचं म्युझिक कसं रिफाईन झालं. दॅट्स वन रिसर्च सॉर्ट ऑफ एरिया. एनी अदर?
नाही, हे थोडंसं बिकॉज काय आहे की आपल्याकडे म्युझिक स्टडीज म्हणजे त्याचा सोशल भाग जरा दुर्लक्षित केला जातो, म्हणून आय फोकस्ड ऑन दॅट. बट इट इज ऑल्सो पॉसिबल टू डू अ कम्प्लिटली कॉर म्युझिकोलॉजिकल स्टडी, विच अ लॉट ऑफ पीपल इज, आय मीन नथिंग इज कॉर, completely core anything, overlaps असतातच, but to put your focus on the music itself is certainly possible. I don't want to give the message that you have to focus entirely on the social, असं काही नाही.
म्हणजे अनिश प्रधान वगैरे अशा त्या टाईप मध्ये?
अनिश प्रधान इज his scholarly work, अनिशजींचं is historical work. It's proper rigorous history. So he'll do extensive archival research in libraries and go through old documents and lay out facts. So त्यांचं कलोनियल बॉम्बे, हिंदुस्थानी म्युझिक इन कलोनियल बॉम्बे, त्यांचं जे पुस्तक आहे, दॅट इज दॅट काइंड ऑफ वर्क. सो दॅट इज नॉट
म्हणाला ते
कॉर म्युझिकोलॉजिकल.
हे अशोक रानडेंचं
सम ऑफ रानडेजीज वर्क, येस सर्टनली. आय वुड से माय ओन ग्रँडफादर्स वर्क, घरंदाज गायकी जे आहे, घरंदाज गायकी नावाचं त्यांचं 60s मध्ये निघालेलं पुस्तक आहे. इट्स अ एस्थेटिक अनालिसिस, वन ऑफ द फर्स्ट अर्लिएस्ट एस्थेटिक अनालिसिस ऑफ द घरानास, ऑफ द म्युझिक. किंवा इन द रिसेंट टाइम्स जर पाहिलं तर मार्टिन क्लेटन, अगेन द गाय आय जस्ट कोटेड फ्रॉम, ही हॅज अ होल बुक पब्लिश्ड बाय ऑक्सफोर्ड युनिव्हर्सिटी प्रेस ऑन टाइम इन इंडियन म्युझिक. सो लय ताल या विषयावरचं पुस्तक इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ द लार्जर म्युझिकॉलॉजी ऑफ टाइम इन म्युझिक ॲज अ ह्युमन ॲक्टिव्हिटी ॲट अ व्हेरी फंडामेंटल लेवल. सो असं दॅट्स वॉट आय मीन बाय कॉर म्युझिकॉलॉजिकल वर्क, असं पण असू शकतं. किंवा लाईक डॅनियल म्युझिक, सो मार्टिन क्लेटन्स वर्क, फॉर हिम द सोशियोलॉजी ऑफ हिंदुस्थानी म्युझिक इज ॲट द पेरिफेरी of his book. His focus is on Laital, on time in Indian music. Okay? Whereas for Daniel Newman, the actual music is on the periphery. His focus is on the sociology of it. These are two extremes, and there is a spectrum in between where you could put. So I have a bunch of ideas I can give to interested people who want to do this. But before that, I mean, if we have some time, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about something that is close to my heart.
Please.
Which is something I'm excited about because I learned this during my years as a PhD scholar, which is basically advice that my supervisor and other scholars at Manipal Centre for Humanities gave me about music research or any kind of research basically, which was one thing I said, which is I did a 6-month literature review identifying the gaps in the literature. So what are the arguments in your field? Who is saying what? Unfortunately, if you go to shodhganga.com, whatever, which is the repository of Indian PhD dissertations, and you search for dissertations on music, which I did, it is an unfortunate fact that most of them just are not able to bring in this kind of rigor into their work. And these are the reasons for it. So I'm trying to sort of give some ideas about how this can be tackled. Okay.
Please,
so one is to do this, to identify the debates in your field, to read and literally figure out what people are what are the disagreements. Okay, because if you're going to be safe and pick an artist and just stuti sumana udharne je म्हणतात ना, just praise and be very safe, then that's not going to be a contribution. You have to forward the debate on the subject. You have to add to the knowledge of the subject. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is to be specific, to be niche, to really carve out a very definite area that you're going to work on. नाहीतर काय होतं, इमोशन इन हिंदुस्थानी म्युझिक. आता हा इतका मोठा विषय आहे की यू विल एंड अप सेइंग नथिंग ऑफ एनी कॉन्सिक्वेन्स. यू विल जस्ट मेक वेग स्टेटमेंट्स. ग्वालियर घराने की गायकी. There are, I'm sure you'll find 200 PhD theses on this subject. Gwalior Gharane ki gaiki. It's done to death because it's easy to do. You just copy paste references from here and there, but very niche. So for example, my dissertation topic turned out to be the alterity of Kumar Gandharva's music. Alterity म्हणजे वेगळेपण. Examining otherness in the tradition of the Hindustani khayal. This is the title, and in the introduction, I really carve out the whole niche, the whole gap, the exact gap that I'm trying to fill. Okay, that is another thing my PhD advisor told me. Become as niche as possible, to be able to do meaningful work. After doing 20 years of really niche, specific, data-driven work, then maybe you'll be in a position to make a blanket statement about the parampara. You're not yet, which is 100% correct, and most people are not. Correct. Okay. And the other thing that is important is asking disciplinary questions. What are you doing? Music research में तुम्ही काय करताय? Are you doing musicology? Are you doing comparative musicology? Are you doing ethnomusicology? Are you doing culture studies? Are you doing history? Are you doing historiography? Ask these questions. And what are all these words? What do these words mean? So good scholar will even question the disciplines themselves.
पण ते एंडलेस होईल मग.
नाही, पण ते एंडलेस नाही होत, strangely enough. It just makes you more aware and it sharpens your thinking.
But I think that's where the guru is required. कारण तो सांगेल ना थांब म्हणून.
Yeah, absolutely. कारण exact. That is the job of the PhD supervisor. That's and मला खूप मदत झाली की अरे हे तू वाचू नकोस, हे वाच. किंवा because ज्ञानशाखा अनलिमिटेड आहेतच ना.
Correct.
But at least have the ambition to ask these questions. Okay. The other thing that is very important is, again, goes back to our debate on faith and skepticism. Now, thoda here is where people make this distinction between the Indian scholastic idiom and the Western scholastic idiom. Okay. I don't want to make a crude simplistic statement, so I'll just say that one thing that the Western scholastic idiom certainly emphasizes is the idea of complicating something and problematizing something and challenging conventional understanding. So a good PhD dissertation in the Western academic idiom is defined as something that challenges a conventional understanding of any subject. Challenging something that people take for granted is something a good dissertation is expected to do.
आपण कदाचित ऑफलाईन झाल्यावर बोलूया, कारण मला इकडे काउंटर खूप आहे.
शुअर. नाही. सो आय डोंट मीन टू से की इंडियन स्कॉलरशिप इडियम मध्ये हे नाहीये.
नाही, मी म्हणत होतो, माझा जो ब्रॉड सॉर्ट ऑफ, मला पण एक आतून सॉर्ट ऑफ क्वेस्ट चालू आहे जी काही जवळच्या लोकांना माहिती आहे की म्हणजे विद्याधर ओक ज्यांचा पण ऑडिओगॅन मध्ये इंटरव्ह्यू आहे, तर आपल्या इकडे न्यूएन्सेस मध्ये जाऊन एवढा न्यूएन्सेस मध्ये गेलेत की ते कॉम्प्लेक्स सब्जेक्ट मेटाफरनी खूप सोपे करून सांगितलेत. आणि म्हणजे नॉट टू डिसरिस्पेक्ट द वेस्ट, पण तिकडे कॉम्प्लेक्स आहे म्हणून एकदम फ्लॅट करून टाकलंय. म्हणजे आय गिव्ह दिस क्लासिक एक्झाम्पल ऑफ महिने आपल्याकडे जे हिंदू कॅलेंडर प्रमाणे जे महिने आहेत ते न्यूॲन्स्ड आहेत, मूनवर बेस्ड आहेत, खूप खूप इंट्रिकेट आहेत, समजायला कठीण असतील आपल्या एज्युकेशन सिस्टममुळे, पण एकदा कळले की यू कांट अननो इट, लाईक इट्स दॅट सिम्पल. वेअर एज इट्स मेड फ्लॅट की बाबा हे ठीक आहे आणि मग एक लीप इयर टाकून द्या, जस्ट 365 फ्लॅट करा. सो आय हॅव अ डिफरंट आर्ग्युमेंट, मे बी गुड फॉर ऑफलाईन चॅट, बट या प्लीज
No, so see, there are tremendous problems in Western academia. There's no doubt about it. I'm not saying की हे चांगलं आणि हे वाईट आहे, असं मुळीच माझं म्हणणं नाही आहे. So please don't misunderstand. Okay, we can do a whole session on the problems in Western academia. That is also possible. Okay, मला असं वाटतं की आपण 2022 मध्ये आता जे बसलोय, okay, the fact that we are able to have this conversation on Zoom, long distance and everything is a product of a culture that you can to some extent call Western. It comes from industrialization. You can't deny that. Okay, आपण इंग्लिशमध्ये बोलतो हिंदुस्थानी संगीताबद्दल. You can't deny that. This is a reality that we live in today. आहे की नाही? सो त्याच्यामुळे इट इज ऑब्व्हियस दॅट समथिंग इज वर्किंग देअर. ओके, इट इज ऑल्सो इक्वली ट्रू की आपण ह्या माध्यमामध्ये हिंदुस्थानी संगीताबद्दल बोलतोय. सो दिस म्युझिक इज एन्ड्युअर्ड अगेन्स्ट ऑल ऑड्स. दॅट इज ऑल्सो इक्वली ट्रू. ओके, सो थोडंसं आता इतक्या ग्लोबल आणि इतक्या वेगळ्या जमान्यामध्ये, आता यू युअर सेल्फ आर समवन हू इज अन एक्सपर्ट ऑन डिझाईन. यू आर होस्टिंग अ पॉडकास्ट ऑन डिझाईन दॅट इज इंटेंडेड ऑब्व्हियसली फॉर अ ग्लोबल ऑडियन्स. You know, people from, I mean, can you name a country today, the people of which will not benefit from listening to your podcast? It's you know, असं आहे का की फक्त भारतीय लोकांना ह्याचा फायदा आहे किंवा ह्याचा रेलेव्हन्स आहे? असं नाही आहे की नाही? सो इन दिस डे अँड एज कॅन वी मूव्ह पास्ट वेस्टर्न इंडियन अ लिटल बिट, बिकॉज द आयडिया, बघ, द थिंग इज दॅट व्हॉट हॅव ऑल ग्रेट थिंकर्स डन? They have basically, why they called great thinkers? Because they turned some idea on its head. Right? Whether or not you agree with Gandhi, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, is irrelevant. The fact is that there was a rude understanding that the way to overthrow power is through violence, and he comes along and says that no, non-violence is an option. Okay, now of course the politics of this is extremely complex, but at the core of it, at least at a discursive level, it is an upturning of a conventionally held view. राईट. कुमारजी सुद्धा काय येऊन म्हणाले की परंपरा स्थगित झाली आहे. अँड दिस टेन्स टू हॅपन ॲट स्केल. थिंग्स टेंड टू स्टॅग्नेट. When something reaches critical mass, it stagnates, and then someone comes along who will break that stagnation. There is a lot of work done on this phenomenon also. People will say that one person is not actually important, that one person is a representation of currents that were already flowing in that society of breaking stagnation. असं सगळं म्हणता येतं. But upturning an idea, challenging a conventionally held view is not a Western thing. It is a human thing. So, that's what I mean. But what I'm saying is that this is explicitly articulated. So when you do a PhD in this idiom, in the Western idiom, this is in a good institution, this is what is taught to you, this is what is expected to you. की काय stagnation आहे, काय commonly held view आहे. Because commonly held views do turn to become stagnant. म्हणून मला लहानपणी, दिस मे साऊंड व्हेरी नाईव्ह, पण मला लहानपणी नेहमी वाटायचं की इन्कलाब जिंदाबाद. अरे जिंदाबाद कशाला? मिळालं ना स्वातंत्र्य आपल्याला, आता परत इन्कलाब कशाला पाहिजे? वाय इन्कलाब जिंदाबाद? बट दिस इज वाय, बिकॉज थिंग्स ग्रॅव्हिटेट टुवर्ड्स स्टॅग्नेशन. यू नीड समवन टू कम इन, गिव्ह इट एन इंजेक्शन. सो म्हणून मग कॉम्प्लिकेट, प्रॉब्लेमटाईज, आस्क क्वेश्चन्स. आणि हे थोडंसं बदतमीजी वाटते ही आपल्याला मोठ्या माणसांबद्दल प्रश्न विचारणे. पण द स्टान्स आय ट्राय टू टेक इज दॅट नाही, इट्स नॉट बदतमीजी, इट्स इनफॅक्ट इट्स दी ऑपोजिट. इट्स अन अटेम्प्ट टू रिअली गेट क्लोज टू देम. द टर्म फॉर विच आय रिअली लाईक दॅट समवन यूज्ड इज क्रिटिकल इंटिमेसी. So you try to achieve critical intimacy with that person or with that tradition or with that art form.
Beautiful.
So if you keep all of this in mind, then meaningful research becomes possible.
Brilliant. I wish you just keep talking. आणि हा पॉडकास्ट असा एक, म्हणजे मी रिसेंटली एक 6 तासाचा पॉडकास्ट ऐकला, तर डेफिनेटली पीपल आर लिसनिंग टू इट. But just to conclude, अर्थात कुमार गंधर्व like background मध्ये होते थोडेफार. So any learnings that you have sort of any insights that you have discovered or just त्यांच्या काही गप्पा, कारण I would like to be critically intimate.
Yeah, I've spent 4 years trying to do that and I will probably spend a long time continuing to try to do that.
कारण मला एक खास करून का विचारायचं आहे, कारण समजा एक क्लासिकल, म्हणजे मी आता ह्या सॉर्ट ऑफ टर्मॉइलमध्ये आहे, एस्पेशली आफ्टर दॅट टॉकिंग विथ ट्रेडिशन वर्कशॉप नंतर, की एक आहे मान्यता वेअर क्लासिकल म्युझिक असं आलं आणि मग आपलं बेस क्लासिकल आहे, ब्ला ब्ला ब्ला, राईट. आणि दुसऱ्या साईडला कुमार गंधर्व येतात आणि फोक म्युझिक मधनं घेऊन इकडे येतात आणि मग त्यांचं काहीतरी होतं तिकडे. आय डोंट नो व्हॉट हॅपन्ड, बट अँड देन वेन यू डीप डाईव्ह, इनफॅक्ट मी आता रिसेंटली एका कॉन्फरन्सला गेलेलो, तिकडे ऑब्व्हियसली सगळे डिझायनर्स होते म्हणून त्यांना कॉन्टेक्स्ट नसेल, पण ते बोलले की अरे एवढं क्लासिकल आहे आता असं कसं, आणि क्लासिकल सगळ्यात जुनं आहे. तर मला तिकडे ओव्हरऑल बोलावं असं वाटलं की क्लासिकल जुनं नाही, क्लासिकल नवीन आहे, जुनं कदाचित फोक आहे. तर इट इज ऑल लाईक कॉन्व्होल्युटेड अँड, म्हणजे माझ्यासाठी तरी आत्ता सगळं ग्रे आहे. तर सच सिमिलर इन्साइट्स इफ यू कॅन शेअर अँड वी कॅन कन्क्लूड दिस.
राईट. आय थिंक बिकॉज वी कन्क्लुडिंग, कारण खूप मोठे विषय आहेत हे सगळे, ॲज यू नो. पण आय थिंक बिकॉज वी कन्क्लुडिंग, वन वे टू कन्क्लूड वुड बी दिस, की आता कुमार गंधर्व एक पहेली आहेत. ही इज अन एनिग्मा, ही इज अन इम्पॉर्टंट पर्सन इन द हिस्ट्री ऑफ दिस म्युझिक, राईट. सो naturally many people are curious about him, like I was, which is why and just to give credit where it is due, I just want to say that my own teacher, my father Satyshilji, they फारच अगदी, he's the foundation of my thinking आणि ते कारणीभूत आहेत for me to take up this work. And I'll tell you why. The reason is की कुमार गंधर्वांच्या स्टेचरच्या माणसाकडे शिकून he was willing to himself ask questions, to question Kumarji's approach, while simultaneously being head over heels in love with it. And that same attitude and that permission he transmitted to me, ki it is okay to ask questions. देव करत बसायचं नाही की हा माणूस देवच होता, because conversations end there when you do that. Right? So on that note, कुमार गंधर्वांना समजून घ्यायचं असेल किंवा कोणाही मोठ्या कलाकाराला, कुठल्याही विषयाला, ज्या विषयाबद्दल तुम्हाला प्रेम आणि आदर आहे, या विषयाला समजून घ्यायचं म्हणजे एकीकडे तर म्हणणं की अरे हे ग्रेटच आहे. सो कुमार गंधर्वांनी जे काही चमत्कार केले ते का केले, कारण ते ग्रेटच होते, त्यांना देणगीच होती, दैवी देणगीच होती, सो यू से दॅट लाईक ओके, मग आपण हात जोडून विषय संपवतो. पण समजलं काय, हाती काय लागलं, काहीच नाही ह्याच्यातून. So if you want to understand what is happening here, then the devil is in the details. Then you have to dig out what is happening there. And then you are left with no choice but to look at that person or that phenomenon or that art form as a product of a particular moment in history, a particular socio-political, cultural phenomenon. And then look at it from various perspectives. Look at Kumar Gandharva from the perspective of his contemporaries. त्यांना काय वाटलं त्यांच्या गाण्याबद्दल, of his buzurgs, of his disciples, of people who like of our generation who are 2 generations removed from him. ह्या सगळ्या लोकांना का आणि काय वाटतं त्यांच्याबद्दल. अँड दिस क्वेश्चन कॅन टेक हिस्टॉरिकल, सोशल वगैरे वगैरे फॉर्म्स. इट कॅन टेक एक्सक्लुसिव्हली म्युझिकल फॉर्म्स ऑल्सो. सो आय अगेन डोंट वॉन्ट टू गिव्ह आउट द मेसेज दॅट म्युझिक रिसर्च म्हणजे असं हिस्टॉरिकल रिसर्च करणंच आहे. अजिबात नाही. म्हणजे माझ्या वडिलांनी स्वतःचे आयुष्यभर म्युझिक रिसर्च केलं, ते गाऊन केलं. When I was starting out learning singing, someone, well-wisher told me की तू जो काही सांगीतिक विचार करशील, कारण त्यांना माहिती होतं की ह्या परंपरेतला म्हणजे हा आता डोकं चालवणार आणि फालतू प्रश्न विचारणार. सो त्यांनी मला, आणि त्या प्रोसिजरमध्ये गाणं हरवून बसेल, तर तसं होऊ नये म्हणून त्यांनी सल्ला काय दिला की तू जो काही विचार करशील सांगीतिक, तो गाऊनच कर. सो गाऊन म्हणजे आपल्याकडे, आपल्या परंपरेमध्ये खूप झालं आहे. कोणीतरी एक फार नवीन एका रागातली रागातला नवीन विचार पुढे आणायला बंदिश बांधली, तर त्याचा जवाब म्हणून दुसऱ्यांनी दुसरी बंदिश बांधली. ॲज अ रिस्पॉन्स टू अ म्युझिकल आयडिया, अनदर म्युझिकल आयडिया कम्स अलॉंग. दिस इज अ फॉर्म ऑफ रिसर्च, इट्स अ फॉर्म ऑफ स्कॉलरशिप. इट्स नो लेस देन वॉट वी बीन टॉकिंग अबाउट. But the attitude, the approach is very similar, of asking questions, of responding, of being attentive and alert and aware to what is going on. That at its core is what this is all about, I think. And Kumar Gandharva is perhaps the greatest example of someone who did this all his life. He asked questions, he was attentive, aware, emotional, empathetic, sympathetic, critical, you know.
Yeah.
I think, that's basically
Awesome.
what it is.
I think that's a great, I would say, like, not a note to end, but just to continue the conversation forever. जसं पु ल देशपांडे म्हणतात
90s ची बॉलिवूड फिल्म संपली तसं वाटतं मला, द बिगिनिंग असं यायचं ना शेवटी.
हां नाही, पु ल देशपांडे म्हणतात ना तसं की तुम्ही आता सुरुवात करा, म्हणजे आता जर्नी सुरू झाली ॲक्च्युली टू इन्व्हेस्टिगेट. आणि ऑब्व्हियसली आय वुड लाईक टू हॅव यू अगेन ऑन ऑडिओगॅन टू डिस्कस more details of research, some nuances about different forms of music. आणि definitely after 20 years if Audiogyan still survives, की आता 20 वर्षानंतर आपण परत भेटून विचारू की होते का रेबेल खरंच.
अरे बापरे. Okay, that's a little forward thinking. खूप झालं. It would be an absolute honor and a pleasure to come back here. I've had a great time myself. So yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.
Hello! It's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, Gauri is joined by Shweta Nanda. They talk about the financial independence and how it is to be a woman entrepreneur. On Anish Thing, Anish welcomes ultra-marathon runner Shivani Gharat. Shivani shares her journey of how she ran her first marathon, the mindset of a runner, and what it actually takes to run a full marathon. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Naveen, Akash and Shreyas talk about the Korean band BTS serving in the military and its repercussions. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Wing Greens and their latest acquisitions and about the Indian sexual wellness market. And on Shunya One, Sheila Datya is joined by Dinika Bhatia, CEO and founder of Nuttigrities. They talk about coming from a business family and Dinika's journey in creating healthy and guilt-free snacking. Once again, don't forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcasts.com. We have some exciting new merch out there for you. Also, do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And do remember to spread the word about these shows and any other shows you might be listening to. Appreciate them, rate them, and review them wherever you are listening to them. You can also check out all our other shows on youtube.com/IVM Podcasts. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week. Volvo XC40 Recharge, Bumble, Heads Up for Tails, Kotak Privy League Program, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thanks guys, without you this would not be possible.
Do you often find yourself surrounded by conversations about Web3, blockchain, NFTs, DAOs? What are these terms and how do they affect our future on the internet? So many questions, but don't worry, we've got answers to all your questions. Hi, I'm Eklavya Bhattacharya, and on our show Future Proofing, we try to decode the impact of these future technologies on various industries with experts and tech enthusiasts. Tune into new episodes coming out every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app and the website, or wherever you get your podcasts from.